Except I'm not on the screen. Oh, yeah, I am.
Yeah, we're down here. Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this next session, Activating Museums and Archives. In this session, we will welcome preeminent leaders of institutions dedicated to history, education, and remembrance. We'll discuss the unique contributions of museums and archives to public awareness and understanding of the past and its relevance. The conversation today will focus on the importance of surfacing lesser-known histories and connecting diverse public audiences to new research and scholarship. Please join me in welcoming Christian Osterman of the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars, who will serve as the moderator and introduce today's panel. Christian.
Thank you, Michael. Welcome to this session on activating museums and archives. I'm Christian Osterman, as Michael mentioned, and I have the privilege to moderate this session on, in many ways, the public history of what we've been discussing over the past 2 days. That is the role of archives and museums, though I think the next session will also focus even more heavily on the importance of archives and archival research. Let me thank the organizers, in particular the Blavatnik Archive and jMUSE, for a really wonderful job in putting together this conference on Jewish fighters and soldiers in World War II. I, for one, have been moved and inspired by some of the sessions and certainly learned a lot. Maria Yudborovsky reminded us yesterday of Spanish philosophers George Santayana's aphorism, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." Archives and museums play a critical role in public remembrance. And I was delighted to hear about the Plant Museum and Jewish soldiers mentioned by Ambassador Herzog just now in the previous session. In this session, we will hear from 3 leading representatives of the world of archives and museums about how their institutions have dealt with the issue of Jewish fighters and soldiers and how they have sought to counter the prevailing stereotypes and distorted narratives that were laid out very well at the beginning of the conference by Alex Blavatnik. As earlier sessions have shown, there's actually an increasingly rich, largely academic literature on the contributions of Jewish fighters during World War II. Yet to what extent is this reflected in the public exhibits, repositories, and displays? Our distinguished panelists, the amazing Julie Chervinsky from the Blavatnik Archive, Gordon Nick Mueller, the president of the National World War II Museum, and James Taylor, assistant director of narrative and content at the Imperial War Museum, will first introduce their institutions, and then we'll look at how their institutions deal with the notion of Jewish fighters within their exhibit narratives, including the question raised also in earlier panels, how unique or how universal Jewish soldiers really was. We then hope to discuss how crucially these institutions bridge to their respective audiences in a variety of ways. Finally, we will discuss how we can preserve the memories of Jewish World War II veterans and the responsibilities of curators in doing so before we will look in our final round at shortcomings, gaps, and strategies to overcome them at the end of the session. I've asked all of them to tell us some stories, so we won't just discuss these things in the abstract. The session is a roundtable, so the discussion will be mostly among the panelists, but if any audience members have questions or comments, please send them along using the Q&A function, and I will try to work them into the discussion if time. So with that, let me go to our distinguished panelists and ask each of them to talk a little bit about the mission and scope of each of your institutions. We'll start, I think, with James Taylor. James, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Christian. And I'd like to also thank the Blavatnik Archive and jMUSE for inviting me to speak at this wonderful conference. First, a little bit about Imperial War Museums. The Imperial War Museum was conceived in 1917, so when the outcome of the First World War hung very much in the balance, and it was opened to the public 3 years later. The museum's terms of reference were not intended or expected to go beyond the First World War, the war to end war, so there's some irony in my talking today about the Second World War. It was a conflict which IWM was never intended to cover. Today, our terms of reference cover all wars involving British and Commonwealth forces from the First World War to date. And as Imperial War Museums, we now have 5 branches. IWM London, our flagship branch with the imposing naval guns on the forecourt, IWM North in Trafford, Greater Manchester, and historic sites, so the Churchill War Rooms, Churchill's secret wartime headquarters in central London, and the warship HMS Belfast moored on the Thames, and the historic airfield at IWM Duxford. The museum was established to make sure that we never forget what it is like to live in a world torn apart by conflict. Yet it is not a war memorial, and nor is it specifically a military museum. We tell the experience of societies in time of war, the human experience of conflict. Our purpose was and is to collect, to sift through the products, debris and memorabilia of war, and to reflect not just on the roles of the armed forces, but the efforts of the nation as a whole. And our vision is to develop and communicate a deeper understanding of the causes, course and consequences of war. Onto our collections. I mentioned human experience, and this is a huge reservoir of human experience. The collections number some 33 million items. These range from 3-dimensional objects such as weaponry and uniforms, to documents and oral history, film and photographs, and works of art. Each of them tells a human story. And in fact, each object has not just one, but multiple stories to tell, and any number of connections with other objects. There are further aspects to the collection that make it so powerful. It's hugely democratic. Much of it, with the exception of our art collection, is mass-produced and was not meant to be mused over. It was made by, used by, and indeed targeted at men, women, and children of all backgrounds. Also, much of it is made up of the intensely personal, such as diaries, letters, small trinkets, items which have held huge personal significance to previous owners. From the very beginning, there was a vision of a museum of public ownership and human experience which distinguished the Imperial War Museum. In 1917, in a letter to the Daily Telegraph, Sir Martin Conway, the IWM's first Director General, wrote of, and I quote, "a divergence from the accepted museum idea." He pointed out, and I quote again, "never before have the people been able to see the work of their own hands as distinct from the work of a few highly specialized exhibitors. And here the humblest war worker will be able to find examples of the work he or she did for the empire." And just to conclude, I think, like all museums, IWM is not a monolith. We change constantly to meet audience needs. And only last month, we opened new Second World War and Holocaust galleries, which bring to the fore new scholarship and understanding for our audiences. But in creating them, we always had at the front of our minds our founder's vision of a place for public engagement with a shared past. Thank you.
Thank you, James. May I now move to Nick Miller?
Yes. Let me just say at the outset that just one my correction. I am no longer president CEO, but I'm president and CEO emeritus. So that gets a little bit into the founding of this museum. We didn't start in 1917. We have a much younger history. I must add too that unlike the Imperial War Museum and others, we are not either a state or a federal institution. We're a private nonprofit, and I am though semi-retired and still hired to do research and write books and complete our last pavilion. I am in the emeritus role at this point. But we were charged by a congressional resolution. Let me just say that as a co-founder, along with my dearest and best friend here in New Orleans until he died, was Stephen Ambrose. And so this museum is an unlikely beginning without initial federal support. It began in the backyard to do a small D-Day museum, to a national D-Day museum. We envisioned to tell the story of D-Day because America had no national museum till World War II. The World War II Memorial wasn't open yet, and we didn't open until 10 years later. And we opened downtown, and then later changed our mission within a couple of years to encompass all of World War II from the American experience in the war. So it's important to point out that we're not federally mandated. We're independent. We're governed by our own board of trustees. But we are charged by Congress through a congressional resolution in 2004 to change our mission to tell the American experience of the war, why the war was fought, how it was won, which is the war itself, and then to focus on the meaning. I would say also, similar to the Imperial War Museum, we're not strictly speaking a military museum. We look at the social, economic aspects of the war. What began as an idea from Steve Ambrose was that we might spend as much as $4 million. And we now have 7 pavilions. We're not in 7 locations as Imperial War Museum. We got 7 pavilions here, and that $4 million idea is now about 400 million and is about 400,000 square feet. The emphasis is really for us is again on the American experience. So we do not pretend to cover all theaters of war, all different countries in Asia and Europe, except as the war advanced by America and American allies. Our design approach is personal because we have some 12,000 oral histories, curated oral histories that have, for the most part, been digitized. And these personal testimonies were used originally from just D-Day in Normandy by Steve Ambrose for his best-selling book on D-Day, which came out in 1994, and then the Citizen Soldier. So there's very much a bottom-up approach to telling the story in this museum from those personal testimonies, but we also look at the broader policies and campaigns and strategies of the war, as well as the legacies of the war, which is our final pavilion. The metaphor for our whole story is really about the journey. So it's the road to war, it's the road to Tokyo, it's the road to Berlin, and then the legacies and consequences. And we, as is in most museums, and certainly Imperial War Museum would be in this same tone. We look at courage, sacrifice, stories of sacrifice, values, outcomes, the violence of the war, and it's not just the bang bang stories of the battles, and we explore and advance our mission through on-site visitation, of course, which just before COVID, everything changed with COVID, but before that, about 850,000 visitors a year, about 150,000 members nationwide who support the mission of the institution. Very high rankings with TripAdvisor, so it's become a destination attraction. But we execute the mission so on-site, we execute it online, we do conferences and tours just like this one, some always with streaming components, and we try to look at the end of it with the lasting legacies of the war. We look at this from the point of view of what does it mean today. So how do we tell our visitors 50 years from now why there's a museum dedicated to telling that story of World War II? What difference did it make to America and to the world that the Allies won? And that is the final exhibit that we have. So the Jewish veterans, just like African American veterans, are encountered where they fit into the stories and the narrative. This is a chronological story that we've told, but we have special exhibits and conferences to go into other details. But the broadest arc of the story is chronological.
Thank you so much. Finally, Julie, you've already shared some of the amazing elements of the archive, but here now is the opportunity to lay it out a little bit more comprehensively. Julie.
Thank you. Oh my God. Thank you so much, Christian. And yeah, I want to join absolutely everybody. The thanks is to the organizers and our academic really panel who put this incredible program together, who put us together. Um, and I'm thrilled to be here with you. And I think it's especially interesting because we represent such different institutions and such different approaches. So really kind of to be able to share that range. We're also on the youngish side, the very youngish, especially compared to the Imperial War Museum. We were founded in 2005 by American industrial philanthropist Blavatnik, and really with a commitment to cultural heritage and support uh, for primary source-based scholarship. Um, the holdings are predominantly, we didn't come at all, there was no war angle. The holdings are predominantly on modern Jewish history, Soviet Russia, World War II, World War I. Having said that, there's so much overlap between all of that that it's difficult to just put it into these different buckets. We are a growing archive, so our acquisitions do tend to focus on median types and subject areas that are often not found at other institutions, and which also supplement and enhance the collections that we already have. So in case in point, the veteran oral history and ephemera project is really, we felt, actually we discovered in our first acquisition these letters that were folded as triangles, which meant letters from the front because there was a shortage of paper, and there were just Jewish names by those who wrote it. There was no Jewish content whatsoever. And we realized that this chapter in history, this topic of Jewish soldiers, has not been covered really as a focus by other institutions. And so we really kind of launched this project, which and I'll get to that as far as our structure in a minute. We're certainly not buildings and many staff. We decided to focus again the heritage and so forth on the Soviet Red Army because it fits within that modern Jewish history, Soviet, World War II and World War One. And so 1,200 unique video interviews on the topic, 11,000, nearly 12,000 items from personal archives like documents, letters, diaries, and so forth are part of that collection. Overall, like I said, we try to tell a full story with our collection. So it could be we have 52,000 postcards of World War One, not on a Jewish or Russian topic, but it was an entirety of a story, predominantly from there's German, there's French, and so forth. At the same time, some of our collections are really focused, like the Kantidicus family letters, which is comprised of 650 or more letters between one couple, Lithuanian young Jewish couple, are, very enthusiastic, Jewish, communist. Uh, he's at the front, she's in evacuation. They're writing to each other daily, sometimes twice a day, to the point where I think some of our studies are suffering as a result. Um, and so our shortly after we really our founding is we decided to take the route of a digital archive. We decided not to become a brick and mortar institution. Really, right from the beginning, the idea was providing maximum access to as many people as possible to the raw holdings to start. Um, and so we right from the beginning we've been implementing layers and layers of what that means, so very high visual, so we try to make the virtual experience as close as possible to the in-person experience that we can, really first focusing on the scholars, so layers of very high sort of image delivery, layers of data, everything from, I mean, not everything has this as much as we can, but the transcripts, the translations of those transcripts, the metadata across all the collections. Now, obviously, this is an ongoing process, and as we're are a growing archive, I feel like every time I say, what's the percent online, it keeps being 10%, even though I promise we're really working on it. And it is, as you know, it's just a lot of steps. The last thing I do want to, because I think to get a sense of our institution, I have to share with you our team, who are the people who are working on this. So we're not many. There is and that means we're very, very hands-on in everything that we do. Aaron Kreisworth, our creative director, and so much more. I've been working with him side by side since the very beginning. Olga Greco, our brilliant editor, fundamental to our efforts to share with the public. News team member Natalia Smotrov, who's helping us with daily operations, and Leonid Reines, who's my father. He met and interviewed more than 950 of the veterans in our collection. He transcribed thousands and thousands of pages and oral testimonies. He continues to populate the information. And of course, this is with the support, the guidance, the trust of Len and Alex Blavatnik. I tell you this because the point is there's a personal investment in this archive. It's we really, each one of us, it's a very small team that we know every piece of it.
Thank you, Julie. Coming from a program that also is a very small team with a digital archive, I understand the challenges you face. But let's bring the conversation after I think you laid out kind of the landscape very nicely. Focus on the notion of Jewish fighters and their experiences, the topic of our conference. How does your institution try to bring forward these stories? How are they embedded in your collections? And question of how similar or universal, different or unique from experience of other minorities among the troops. I also wonder if this question could allow us to think a little bit about expanding the Jewish fighter beyond the soldier, to partisans, to the home front, to resistance, and to other representations. So, what are examples in your collections and or possibilities you might consider for the future? Let's do another round, and maybe we'll start with Nick Miller, if that's all right, Nick.
All right. To be clear, we'd like to discuss here. Like us to discuss the stories from our collections, specifically around Jewish veterans, or what's the broader arc of the story that those stories are contained with. Is that correct? And
That's right.
Not specific examples yet, or would you like that now or later or what?
As you wish. As you wish. You can specific examples are fine as well.
Well, so first of all, I would just go back to the story that we talk about in the broadest sense, and how we bring these stories forward through these chronological exhibits that integrate the American experience from the home front to the war front. So and the aftermath of the war. As I said before, it is grounded in testimonies, but it's also photographs and images and multimedia presentations, environmental exhibits that bring this forward. There's one element that's very important to us, and that is the dog tag experience, which begins on a train car, as where everybody went off to war in some train somewhere in America. And you attach digitally to a particular story of a veteran, different service branches, and you encounter them with that dog tag. You enter your email, you enter that dog tag, and you go through the exhibits, and you encounter that soldier or sailor, airman, and different parts of the story, and you interact with them. And in the case of the Jewish veterans, they would be introduced and along the way. A broader, so they're not separately handled. We don't have a special exhibit on the African Americans in World War II, Jewish veterans, or whatever. There were some 500,000 American Jews who served in World War II, and we have a few of those in our collection. So part of the story too goes into, there's an underlying theme of why we fight. We talk about training films that began to talk about the enemy, and that we're fighting fascism, and these are racist regimes. So the origins of that and the motivation for our troops began in the training period. So there is a part of the training of the troops that before they go off to war, whether it's to the Pacific theater or the European theater. So I would not say what I'm trying to make the point is we do not treat the Jewish soldiers as unique. They're part of the mosaic or the tapestry of the overall story. I'll just give you a couple of examples, though. There's one oral history, and it's in our exhibits as part of the dog tag experiences. Hank Greenberg, who was chairman of the board, CEO of AIG, as some of you may have heard of him. He went in with the Signal Corps on D-Day. Later found himself in Dachau, and his story talks about the shocking revelations that occurred and that happened to him when he was in Dachau, and how profound and moving that was. But wouldn't say that his response to the atrocities was any different from other GIs. There's another well-known, because he wrote a book, Hal Baumgarten went in with the Normandy with the 29th Infantry Division, the 116th Infantry Regiment, right into the bloodiest part of Omaha. His regiment was almost entirely slaughtered. I think only 4 survived. But he was a Jew, just like Hank Greenberg, and in his case, he had on the back of his combat jacket, Hitler, here I come. So you have a sense of the racial overtones and what he understood he was fighting for by that. And of course, he left us his memoir, and we have his oral history as well. And then there are other places where we touch on the atrocities and within the larger narrative of what we were fighting for. And but then the most recent thing we've done is a Jewish veteran by the name of Alan Moskin, who was a liberator of Gunskirchen, which is a subcamp of Mauthausen in Austria. And we've created, with the help of the Shoah Foundation, a hologram of Moskin. And you understand how those work with they're asked thousands of questions in a studio. And now visitors can sit in front of that hologram in our museum and ask him any question they want to. And because of the algorithms of the thing, he can sort out the answer. So as these veterans, in this case a Jewish veteran, pass from the scene in a few years, he can still bear witness through his testimony that appears very live to, and people go up to the mic and ask a question, and he answers that. Now, he was born in New Jersey in 1926, and he was in the 66th Infantry Regiment and the 71st Division. And he went in late 45, the 4th and 5th of May, to Gunskirchen, and found 15,000 Hungarian Jews that were abandoned in the camp. And was witness to the fact that some 50,000, or about 10%, died of starvation and malnutrition. And so we have some artifacts from his story too, a German Luger pistol, and there's another GI that was with him in that camp. It was not a Jew, but we have an awful lot of his material, and there's connectivity between the story of Moskin, who's on the hologram, and Sergeant Sweeney, who was there with him. So there's a way to engage visitors, not only in one story, but two. And for Moskin, of course, he says that this changed his life. The war changed his life, that experience in particular. And by the time he was about 1985, he began to think he had something to say. So he began going to schools and kids and talking to kids about the war and that experience, and that he wanted to do that to help those children understand what happens if you let hate and bigotry prevail in the world. And that's a very powerful and compelling way to communicate that story. So those are 2 or 3 examples of how we use those.
Fascinating. James, how does that compare to the Imperial War Museums?
Yes.
Narrative?
I think that, as the Imperial War Museum, I mean, we try to show in the enormous diversity in the armed forces of the combatant nations generally, and not least Britain. I mean, I think the first thing to say is that the British Army was a citizens' army that reflected British society as a whole, and Anglo-Jewish fighters numbered some 60,000, and they served right across the units of Britain's armed forces, so in the Army, the Navy, and the Royal Air Force. And on top of that, of course, you have Jewish refugees to the UK from the pre-war period who serve alongside them. And it has to be said, often after being interned as enemy aliens, and our collections in that area are very strong. I think the other thing to say about the British Army at this time is it was a British Empire army. If I give you one example, I mean, the Desert Rats of the 8th Army, the victors of El Alamein in 1942, contained not just British soldiers, but Australian, Indian, Czech, Free French, Greek, New Zealanders, Poles, Rhodesians, and South Africans. And of course, it would be joined in 1944 by the newly formed Jewish Brigade Group. So there's a huge amount for us to cover for our audiences there. On top of that, in terms of our collections, we also have some what you might call oddities. In one area of our new Second World War galleries covering the Eastern Front, we actually display orders and medals awarded to a Jewish Red Army soldier, Giersch Yossmann, who, after a severe wound, he was an infantryman, became a combat medic, rescuing wounded comrades under fire. So something that's kind of crept into our collection, but fascinatingly so. I mean, I would say I cannot claim specific expertise on the experience of Jewish soldiers in the British Armed Forces, but from my reading in this area, and when I say reading, I mean looking at our collections, their experiences very often echo those of the non-Jewish combatants, yet there's always something else. And some of the key themes I picked up on: the fear of what might happen if they fell into German captivity, concern for relatives in Nazi-occupied Europe, opportunities or lack thereof for religious observance, dealing with instances of anti-Semitism from fellow soldiers and citizens, which seems surprisingly rare, but I'd like to investigate that further. And then finally, I think sometimes the challenges to faith, having witnessed the aftermath of Nazi crimes. So I'd like to just give a couple of examples from our collection. Mm-hmm. It's very, very difficult to pick. But a classic example of a Jewish fighter for me would be somebody called Klaus Adam, and we hold an oral history of that IWM conducted with him. Klaus came from a very distinguished German family based in Berlin. He emigrated to the UK in 1934 with his mother, father, and siblings after the family firm, a famous sports department store in Berlin, was seized by the Nazis. His father died 2 years later of a broken heart, as Klaus puts it. And his mother then ran a boarding house in North London, which became a gathering point for an eminent refugee circle. Klaus trained as an architect, and like so many refugees, he and his younger brother were summoned for internment with a knock on the door from the police, despite him being in a reserved occupation designing munitions factories and shelters for the War Office. And it was only an intervention from his boss that got him off. But Klaus said, and as he put it, he was getting itchy. He wanted to fight. He served first in the Pioneer Corps and then joined the RAF and became, in fact, the first German pilot to fly with the Air Force. In October 1944, he joined 609 Squadron, flying Hawker Typhoons, and he served in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, carrying out low-level rocket attacks upon German troop movements, and these were especially dangerous for pilots. One of the interesting things for me is that Klaus at first calls himself Keith Howard Adams on operations in case he's captured. Indeed, his name changes several times and suddenly the name Ken sticks and he can't remember, so he becomes Ken Adam. And you may know him better as Sir Ken Adam, the designer of sets for the classic early Bond films and Dr. Strangelove, Stanley Kubrick's film. And I went to visit Sir Ken some 15 years ago for an exhibition at the IWM on Ian Fleming and James Bond. And he talked with huge eloquence about his work on the Bond films, as you would expect. But what really struck me was he kept drawing me back to a scale model of a Hawker Typhoon in the markings that his aircraft had had. And what was so important for him, as he says in the interview we have at IWM, as a pilot, I was able to do something actively against the Nazis, which many of his family murdered by the Nazis could not do. So I suppose that's a story of a fighter in the accepted sense. Yet for me, the idea of the fighter goes beyond the soldier, sailor or airman. I've said before, this was a war fought by whole societies, and the stories of those who served on the home fronts are as critical to our understanding of the conflict as are the histories of the combatants. Jewish men and women served in Britain's factories, on farms, along with their fellow citizens. One lovely oral history, again, we have is from Nemia Sirota. She was from London. She grew up in a family of Zionists. She went on an agricultural course in Palestine in 1937, but she only did 18 months as she knew war was coming. She enrolled in the Women's Land Army with a friend, and on the outbreak of war was sent to agricultural college. One thing I'd like to emphasize here is joining the Women's Land Army. It has a bit of a glamorous reputation in the UK, and this is one of the things that we try to overturn at IWM. Essentially, it was not a soft option at all. She was a farm labourer. Pay was well under half the national average, and half of that was deducted for board and lodging. The basic working week was 48 hours in winter, 50 in summer, though if you had an unscrupulous farmer, it could be worse. And as Nemia states in the interview, they seemed to try to send you as far away from home as possible, which in her and her friend's case meant a farm near Grimsby, where lodgings were a small room with no heating and no running water. And she generously describes it as primitive. Nemia was fed by, the person that fed her was a wagoner's wife. They lived in a separate cottage. And she was really happy to conform to Jewish dietary laws. And as Nemia says, we were never hungry. There was no prejudice at all. But she then moves back to London and delivers milk for a dairy. And she gives two examples of anti-Semitism directed at her and her family. She talks of an extremely nice woman who used to invite her in for coffee every day while on her milk round. One day, the woman made remarks about Jewish women not doing war work. And Nemia responds, well, you may not believe it, but I'm Jewish, and there are a lot of Jewish girls doing this sort of work. The response from the woman, I would never have taken you for Jewish. Nemia never goes again. And then she tells another story. Her brother was wounded, and he came home on leave. Her mother was out with her brother, and they were in a shop, and someone passed and said, there you are, these Jewish boys, they don't go into the army or navy or the air force. And so Nemia's brother lifted his hat and showed his scar. And yet, despite this, she talks of a wonderful unifying atmosphere. And she says the feeling in the Jewish community was that it was really important for everyone to do their bit. And I'd like to just quickly add another thing here. In terms of Jewish fighters, again, I think it's really important to think of resistance and think of that broadly too. And I mean resistance in Nazi-occupied territories, of course. And obviously one includes here groups such as the 1943 ghetto fighters, those who served in partisan units. But there's also, I think, those who engage in sabotage work, for example, in Nazi factories, the recording and revealing of Nazi crimes, the practice of Jewish culture and education in the ghettos. All of this was anathema to the Nazis. And for me, there's a couple of other objects I'd quickly like to mention, which I count as resistance and fighting. There's the belt worn by Rudolf Verbar during his escape with Alfred Wetzler from the Auschwitz-Birkenau death camp, which we have on display in our new Holocaust galleries. And also something seemingly innocuous, a small cello made in a sub-camp of Ravensbrück concentration camp by a young woman, Clara Rakos, for the 21st birthday of her friend Eva Hamburger, who before the war had aspired to be a professional cellist in Budapest. And as I say, both of those in their very different ways are for me examples of resistance and defiance towards the Nazis. Thank you.
James, we are having a little technical difficulty, and so we're waiting for Christian to jump back. Please take the floor.
Yeah, we're hoping to see Christian back, but I can at least in the meantime answer the question, which I'm just going to bring back to what is the notion of Jewish fighters. And in our case, of course, because the focus is the Jewish soldiers in the Red Army, the examples are too many. But I think it's really important to remember and remind there is not one single experience. When we say, what is the Jewish experience? There's not a single one. Our collection, while it is 1,200 interviews, it has to be contextualized. They're a certain age, everybody we interviewed. I mean, they were a certain age fighting in the war. They were mostly in their late teens to around 22 or so. They were predominantly educated. They were raised in a certain environment with a certain spirit. So in that beginning Soviet period when so many of these young Jews signed on to the ideals of what it was. And geography had an enormous impact on their identity. Um, also, for many, it wasn't one role, whether they were just in the army as fighters, whether they were in resistance. For many, I just want to remind, it was 4 straight years of war. It wasn't months, it wasn't weeks, so it's a long time. And so for many, it includes, evacuation, then army, or marches and ghettos and escape, partisan, in a single experience. They sort of had to, many of them, go through so many of these experiences. For example, we have the diary and the testimony that was by Josip Protas, which was recorded in Belarus. He was 16 years old when he began the diary. And before the war, he starts, about friends and girls and school and, what is this year going to be like? And then it's the first year and it's the first day in Minsk and Germany attacks and he sees people dying on the street. He's just a kid, unexpected. And the diary takes us through his evacuation, when his clothes, when his boots, when his shoes are falling apart. His father is MIA. They get the notice that likely his father is gone. And to join the army, for many of them, was a much better option. It was almost saving them as an option, where at least there was some food rations, there was some. So, it's so hard to say fighting resistance and putting it into these different buckets. It was 4 years of struggle in so many different ways. To survive and to fight, and obviously for many was avenge. Konya Epstein, who we saw earlier today, sending his message, he watched his family get murdered, and then he joined the partisans and he fought there. Mark Epstein, he's on our website as well. He was in the Leningrad blockade in the worst of it, when his mother thought he was the devil because everybody was losing their mind, and because he ate a cat's eye and his eye was shining. And then he joined the army, and he was actually mobilized in 1942, and he helped break the blockade. All of that to say, so many different unique individual experience. Is there something general that can be said about the Jewish experience? There's a final note of sensitivity. We, as the people, or as the archive, or as the institution where they entrusted their story, I find an obligation and a fear not to misrepresent their own perspective and lens through our historical analysis and contextualization, because they see it from a very personal perspective. Having said all of that, I guess overall, um, there overall, right, they would probably say there was no anti-Semitism on the front, because we were all fighting a common enemy together, and we were all these different ethnicities and people and backgrounds, but there was this one horrible enemy in front of us on the front lines. We had to fight really hard just so no one would say, no, I mean, obviously, but this notion of not to be called a coward, because uh, it didn't just start with the war, right? These images were long, long before and known and spread. And finally, an extra score to settle as a Jew, as they knew what was happening with their relatives, with their family, with their loved ones.
Back to you. You can hear. So as we try to sort out whatever the challenges are with the technology, perhaps we can move on. Julie, you want to take another stab at another topic, and then we will venture back over to James and then to Nick. Oh, we can't hear you, Julie.
Just going to say, considering how organized our panel is, we actually all discussed the topics that we were going to bring up. So this was how the about sort of the idea of the Jewish soldiers and what that meant. And I think on our next one, we were going to talk about bridging to our audiences, interacting with them on site or digitally, education, research programs. So please, I think we're just going to stick to the order. James, if you wouldn't mind starting.
Not in the least. No, be happy to, Julie. So in terms of bridging with audiences and interacting with them, I'm sure my fellow panelists would agree this is something one could write tomes on. I suppose I think the first thing is to understand who your audiences are and their disparate wants and needs, and design your programs and events accordingly. I suppose that also the thing to recognise here is that museums are not just display spaces anymore and a showcase for objects. They're also spaces for conversation, debate, and performance, and conservation, of course, as well. At IWM, we reach audiences through any number of avenues, too many to list here. The first thing that I would say is we endeavour to produce superb, beautifully paced exhibitions in which the objects and human stories behind them illuminate greater truths. Those exhibitions are underpinned by rigorous research, and we do that in collaboration with academic advisory boards. And we also work with associates from our Research and Innovation Hub, the IWM Institute. And I should say the associates come from multidisciplinary backgrounds, so not just history, but also broadcasting, journalism, cultural programming, art, psychiatry, and theatre. Exhibitions used, of course, to mean the single physical display put together by a single curator or a small team at one site, which audiences could only access if they could reach that site. At IWM, we have for the past 4 years broadened the concept to include associated learning programs, events, conferences, experiences, and digital outputs. When I say digital outputs, I mean digital not just as bolt-on, but as part of the overall experience. And permanent exhibitions act as a spine. So at IWM London, we have First and Second World War galleries and the Holocaust galleries. And now we're working on Cold War and contemporary spaces, as well as new art, film and photography galleries. And we also have plans afoot to transform and refresh all our other sites. So there's this constant thing of churn, of changing to meet audiences. And in terms of that changing offer, we have begun to take a season-based approach in which all programming addresses the chosen theme. I'll give some recent and very varied examples of ways we've reached and are reaching audiences at the museum. So for our 2017 Syria season, we held a pop-up conflict cafe with drinks and Syrian delicacies provided by chef and former refugee Imad Al-Narnab. Anyone could attend and come and have a chat and find out from people who'd fled Syria about the realities of a seemingly distant crisis. For our Making a New World season, which looked at the aftermath of the First World War, a feature of the season was I Was There, Room of Voices. And this was a kind of designed, darkened room in which visitors could hear voices from our oral history collection, revealing what the end of war meant for them, be that joy or grief. I mean, it was extraordinarily powerful. And most importantly for us, it also showed how effective sound could be when used on its own in a designed environment. I mean, previously, sound had been one of those things, you know, pick up a phone and have a listen to this. But this was a special experience which took everything that sound had to offer and brought it to the fore. For our refugee season, we foregrounded in the exhibition 7 academic research projects on subjects from tracing Belgian refugees, which looked at the 250,000 Belgian refugees who came to the UK in the First World War through a filmed interview. There was another project as well we focused, one of these that was Crossing the Mediterranean Sea by Boat, a project that featured an animation based on interviews with 4 refugees. And we also held for the same season a virtual festival created by our IWM Institute, Refugee Nights, and this was during lockdown. And this explored refugee stories through talks, eyewitness accounts and music, and showed how refugees have made such a rich contribution to British public life. To sit alongside the new Holocaust galleries, IWM has developed a new Holocaust learning programme for students aged 13 plus, which it has launched alongside the new galleries. And so it's been created by IWM experts, a leading digital studio and an award-winning writer. And it uses technology, IWM collections and storytelling to encourage reflection, discussion and understanding of the Holocaust. But crucially, the programme is not just delivered on site in the new Holocaust galleries, it's also available online. And finally, I suppose another strand of programming I'd like to highlight is our Conflict of Interest podcast, in which an IWM curator, together with experts and witnesses, takes a celebrity guest round IWM London and helps them to understand a recent or ongoing conflict. It's had extraordinarily good reviews. And I think that this is one of those things, we weren't sure it was going to work. Yet that and all of the examples I've just mentioned, they all worked and we didn't know that they would. And I think as a museum professional, one must be prepared to fail, to learn from that failure. But the key thing is you have to show you tried. Thank you.
No, we cannot hear you. And we can't hear you either, Nick.
Nick, I believe you're on mute. If you would unmute. All right, we are.
Oh, perfect.
There we go.
Okay. All right. If everybody can hear me, should I go next, or Julie, or you?
Please go ahead, Nick.
All right. Well, in terms of the engagement, interaction with visitors, let me just say we had, as a young institution, a different starting point than most of the rest of you. We, as I had said earlier, we only opened our doors in 2000, June 6, 2000, D-Day, actually. And then 4 years later, we had completed the master plan to build all these pavilions out on 3 city blocks in downtown New Orleans. And by the way, I should say we are here in New Orleans instead of the nation's capital because of Stephen Ambrose, President and former Supreme Commander Eisenhower. The latter asked Stephen Ambrose in 1968 or thereabouts when Stephen was editing his papers, did you ever know Andrew Higgins? Well, Steve said, I know of him, but he died in the 50s. Well, he said he's the man, and his boats are the man who won World War II. And those are the landing craft, the LCBPs, and which were used not only in Normandy, but all throughout the Mediterranean and the Pacific. And Steve Ambrose was so struck by that comment that it inspired him to set up the Eisenhower Center of Leadership Studies to start doing the oral histories, which then led to the D-Day Museum. So we were moving quite nicely along with the D-Day Museum in the first 4 or 5 years. And then Hurricane Katrina pretty much shut down the entire city. There was nobody in the city for the next year or two. Nobody knew at the time. But that motivated me to start thinking beyond the boundaries of the museum. How do you fulfill your mission as a museum if there's nobody in your city, nobody likely to come, and your whole city is filled with water for the next month or a year or so? So we made a big commitment to digitizing our entire collection and a commitment to distance learning, and various kinds of interactives that would engage visitors when they ever came back. And so we began to look for partners and invest in technology. Before we even had the first World War II pavilion out of the ground in 2009. We partner with Arizona State University, for example, to offer a joint master's degree on World War II studies. We have millions on Facebook and social media postings, virtual conferences that we did this past spring. We did one that was prompted by COVID, as this one probably is too. And I had some 13,000 people online streaming with us. So there is the investment in technology to engage visitors across the country and really across the world. It's building our website. Distance learning is a major priority with the museum, still is. And we got a reminder of another hurricane this past on the same day, August 29, after some 16 years after Katrina. In any event, the research core of our institution is something that was one of my last actions. There were two parts of this. One was to establish, similar to what James is talking about, an institute, in our case, Institute for the Study of War and Democracy. So you can see we have a focus on the interrelationship between war, the founding of our own country, the Civil War, which had to also was important in the survival of democracy and what was envisioned by the founding fathers. And in the 20th century, of course, the war to defend our freedom and democracy. But you can go all the way back to the birth of democracy in the ancient Greeks, created some 2,500 years ago, and appreciate that, as well as the Roman Republic, appreciate that war and democracy and the citizen soldier and citizens as they knew it in ancient times are very, very important. So that's part of the broader arc of the story. So distance learning and also teacher training, both online and we do institutes that are done by that institute I was describing. That institute contains our historians, some of the top World War II historians in the country populate that. It's not a large department, but alongside it is the Media and Education Center, which is where we invested heavily into our studios and places where we can do podcasts and we can have live programs in our auditorium there that we can do the same thing the TV networks can. We can bring people in and interview them like we're doing here and export our programs at the same time. We also partner with universities across the country on overseas tours. We do many of them ourselves. And we use technology, we hope, in the most appropriate ways. But the Institute is the engine of our research and helps to assure the authenticity of what we put on the airwaves or on the broadband. But we also drill down into individual stories. We have one interactive exhibit that we opened about 8-9 years ago, which is what would you do in interactive? And it creates a moral dilemma from World War II, and whether it's in a combat situation or a recruiting situation where racial discrimination is palpable, and in some cases, and discrimination at the recruiting station leads to a question of, would you, after you've been abused because of your race, would you decide to not enlist, or what would you do? And the visitors get to vote. One that's very appropriate, I think, for this conversation is one of those interactive stories is Edgar Maurer, who was a Jew in Berlin before at the rise of Hitler, and was a Pulitzer Prize winner, was living in Berlin with his family. and reporting for the Chicago Daily News. Very, very critical of Hitler and the rise of Hitler. And I mean, he's not a Jewish veteran here, but both the moral issues, the courage that he displayed, as well as the fear and the threats to his family, the freedom of the press and religion, are all embodied in that in the situation that he found himself in, because he was a target of the Nazis. His family was being targeted. He wanted to, in September of '33, wanted to go to the big Hitler rally in Nuremberg. And he was told by Ambassador Dodd, who'd just been appointed, that the State Department didn't think they could protect him. The German ambassador to the United States told him the same thing. But he was committed to capturing the story, but his family was being threatened. So what would you do? Would you leave, or would you stay and risk your own life as well as the life of your family? So this is a way that to engage visitors in a dilemma and a challenge, and they all vote, and then you get to see how everybody voted on the screen, and so you have immediate feedback as to what others do. So that's just a variety of ways that we try to interact and engage visitors, both on site as well as our online opportunities with our partners.
I might jump in there and actually maybe go right from answering this question on to the next one, since I think we don't have all that much time left. Yeah, in our case, again, first of all, there's just a changing role over the last now, considerable number of years of what archives are, where it used to just be a place of sort of guardianship of primary resources. Now, of course, all archives are trying to share as much as they can. But also, archives were not a place of sort of storytelling and contextualization. It was really just holding these primary sources for others to use. Now, that role has changed as well. And so in our case, we provide as many layers. Again, first it was about the academics, but now we are engaging those academics to tell stories specifically for the public with us. I would say from the early on, the visual, dynamic, sort of high quality idea was right from the get-go. And we're trying to work with the academics in creating those stories themselves, for basically the curious. Now we do have public, some physical exhibits. They're all traveling exhibits. We believe that that's very important. Again, because we don't have that brick and mortar institution. And I do want to, though, have enough time to just touch on the issues of preserving memories and how we deal with that of Jewish veterans from the past, those who are passing from us. And I think there is, before we even, there's a responsibility while they are not gone that I think sometimes we fail to do, or people as a whole. Um, it's incredible. We have a diary, Pavel Elkinson. He started in 1944 when he was just crossing sort of the Soviet border. And I'm going to read two entries to you. May 8th, 1945. In the afternoon, I'm sorry, of course, this now. One second. I'm going to look at another screen. So he says, in the afternoon, we found out about Telbuchin's 11 o'clock European time announcement ordering cessation of all military activities. Germany capitulated. I can't believe it. At 11, we reached our objective. The silence is deafening, not a single shot. It's strange. We got so used to it all that it was difficult to learn how to live otherwise. May 9th, 1945. The sun is shining. It's quiet. We got so used to a life of freedom that it will be very difficult to have to get used to barrack living again. The war is over. Don't see any enemy soldiers. Sometimes we come across scattered single soldiers. The rest probably went to surrender to the Allies. They're still afraid of us, though we don't lay a finger on them. We frequently even see a Fritz catching a ride in one of our cars. He gets a ride home. How quickly anger goes away. How quickly we forget that which can never be forgotten. That's on May 9th, 1945. That immediately there's already, and decades later in our interview with Boris Feldman, whose town was surrounded immediately after the start of war, who survived the ghetto, participated in underground resistance. In March 1944, day after liberation, he joins the Red Army. In 2008, when we met, he explains the challenge of preserving history. He says, every minute, every hour was a feat, but memories become forgotten. It's like a disease. On the day you hurt, you feel and remember the illness. Then the illness goes away. It goes away from your thoughts and from your conscience. Of course, it is important for people to remember, but unfortunately, when a generation departs, with the passing of a generation, its hardships and difficulties are forgotten. It's important for the generations to want to learn, but it's also important for us, these meetings with these veterans. At the end of the day, they are uh, a personal attention to an elderly person who has such an incredible story to tell. And its work and its time and its patience and its focus to sit down and to listen is very, very important. And at the end of the day, it's a human interest connection. Uh, for the veterans themselves. And the more we can make those connections, there was a daily life of 4 years. We have, I'm sorry, her name just popped out of my head, but she talks about, of course, we danced. Of course, there was horrible and horribleness, but you have to connect just the human moments that are going to, for anybody looking, I think, identify with and say, oh yeah, I can feel that, I can understand that. So I just wanted to, how do we sort of preserve and how do we engage before time is out?
Thank you. Beautifully said.
Thank you.
So I'm going to ask for maybe a final word as we move towards concluding. Nick, maybe we'll start with you if there's anything you'd like to add.
Well, I think we're moving into the issues of memories, preserving memories of not only of Jewish veterans, but other veterans. And I think, as Julie said the other day, is that there's a greater responsibility for museums and curators as these living testimonies and testimonials that are given to us as they pass from the scene. And so in our final pavilion, the Liberation Pavilion, which, as I mentioned earlier, is really around the theme of freedom. We come down very strongly that the great legacies of the war are around the preservation and then the advancement of freedom and democracy and human rights. And these are issues which we bring through the rest of the 20th century and as far into the 21st century as we can go, using things like Freedom House in New York that tracks the freedom by various metrics around the world, the advance of democracy and freedom of the press and freedom of religion. So tolerance and keeping that relevance today as well. And as Faulkner said, history isn't dead; it's not even past. So we have to do our responsibility is to just to preserve that history and to tell it as authentically as we possibly can. And in that pavilion, we first focus on the cost of victory, but we flash back to for younger visitors to the Anne Frank story at the end of the war. So why would we do that? Well, because younger visitors who barely know when World War II occurred, all of us are immersed in that, but they don't even know if it was the last century or the 19th century. And then they see this great conflict with 65, 70 million dead, 40 million civilians. How could this have happened? So through the words of Anne Frank, we try to bring that to life. And then we have a liberation theater where survivors talk about the joy of the moment when, the very moment when American troops opened the gates of the camps. And one survivor says to him after singing Yankee Doodle Dandy, says, "What took you so long?" And the troops are standing there crying, and their survivors are having that experience. It's just it gives that emotional, and as Julie said,
I
it's
don't
not just
understand
about
because
the
it was
thought,
working
it's
fine
about
at the
the
beginning.
feelings as well. And the second floor of that pavilion goes into the Nuremberg trials and the great responsibility theater that is imposed now upon America, which emerges from the war as a superpower for the last century and into this century. And we all have a responsibility to curate those memories, to understand them from the personal testimonies, but also to understand the great arc of the story and what really was the outcome for our country, and both not just the Jewish separation, but advances in women's rights and civil rights, and all of that flows, or I should say, accelerates after the war as a consequence of the war and the focus on human rights.
Thank you, Nick. James, final word?
Yes, I'd just like to say, I mean, I'd just like to add probably to what Julie's really said, that, veterans are and have been crucial to the development of Imperial War Museums. They've spoken to us about their experience, they've helped us to understand, and they've given us their material so that we can tell their stories in perpetuity. And in perpetuity here is very important. Let's remember, most of our visitors and the people who look at our collections have not yet been born. And the passing of the Second World War generation is really important here for us, because I mean, the other thing was that in terms of the way that we displayed objects, certainly at IWM, which has a longer history than Nick's and Julie's organisations, we displayed objects so that they'd be recognised. So my grandparents, for example, took me around IWM and said, that's the type, Grandad would say, that's the type of 25-pounder gun I fired. My grandmother would show me like ration books. She used to work in a food control office. V1 flying bomb killed my father's friend Michael Osborne, and I think they were hugely important, these grandma and grandpa guides. And now I think what this means, that they're passing as that generation goes, it places a huge responsibility and gives curators a great privilege that they must make the object speak to the visitor. They can't simply display extensive collections and expect their visitors to recognise them. And so I think where before curators were guardians of a collection, they're now much more storytellers. That's a key role for them. And they have to independently facilitate dialogue with audiences and act as mediators of perspective, debate, and public memory. It's a big responsibility. But one thing I would like to conclude with, it's been wonderful speaking with Nick and with Julie. Partnership is key here. We need to work with others to better understand our collections. And that means working with other museums, archives, and academia. I know that, Julie, you mentioned us having a chat after we finish this session at some point, maybe next week or something. And let's see what the similarities and differences of our collection, what do they tell us about each other? I think that will be, a fine way forward and a wonderful legacy of this terrific conference. Thank you.
Amen. Amen.
We look forward to it.
Right.
Well, thank you so much.
We're honored for that. That's great. Thank
We
you.
are sorry that Christian had some technical difficulties. We
Sorry.
are delighted and thrilled that we were able to welcome Nick and James and Julie, of course. And ladies and gentlemen, we are going to conclude this panel and move on into the next one. Thank you so much.
Right. Thank you.